All right, we are right at 4 o'clock, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. Wow, over 100 people already. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. We're really excited about our speaker today. I'm Liz Perry, Crow Canyon's president and CEO, hailing from my office here in Cortez. And before we get started with introducing Dr. Kilby, I would like to start with our usual introductory slides. We like to begin with our acknowledgement of the land that we're on and our indigenous partners. We acknowledge the Pueblo, Ute, Paiute, Dene, and Jicarilla Apache people on whose traditional homelands our campus sits. Our work is not possible without indigenous people in the past, present, and future, and we respectfully recognize and honor ancestral and descendant indigenous communities for their contributions to all humankind. We are grateful to all indigenous people and support the preservation and protection of cultural traditions, ancestral connections, and sacred lands. Thank you to all of our partners. As usual on Zoom, if you have questions during Dr. Kilby's talk, go ahead and put them in the Q&A and we will be able to keep track of them better than in the chat. If Zoom gives you a headache, we are live streaming on Facebook and you can watch us there. And as always, please do check out our YouTube channel if you have not subscribed. So many years now of amazing talks that I still go back and watch too. Some fun things upcoming the next couple of weeks. So there won't be a webinar next week, but instead during the webinar time slot, you will be able to view our annual meeting. So we do this every October. We've been live streaming our annual meeting since the pandemic. And it'll be fun as usual if you have seen any of the past ones that are also on our YouTube channel. Lots of update videos from the staff and the different departments, from the field, from the lab, from the research institute, from the educators. They do a great job putting together some awesome updates, as well as I'll give an overall organizational update, and our board chair, Leslie Masson, will be on as well. So please do join us next week if you can. After that, we will just be back to our usual webinar schedule with modeling early maize in the North American Southwest with Dr. Lori Barkwell-Love. As always, a huge, huge thank you to everyone. We are a nonprofit. We are almost entirely funded by donations, and this webinar series is entirely free because of your donations. Thank you, thank you, thank you to everyone. We seriously cannot do this program or do any of our work without your support. If you have not been checking out Dr. Susan Ryan, the Executive Vice President of our Research Institute, started this year a really amazing blog series where she talks about current issues in archaeology and that we work with every day at Crow Canyon. And she has a very cool post out, New Artifacts, Materiality, and Belongings. Very cutting edge and some really nice insights from Dr. Ryan. So please do check out the blogs, kind of keep you up to date on what we're thinking about and talking about here at Crow Canyon with our staff and scholars. Without further ado, I'm very excited that we have Dr. David Kilby with us today to talk about research that never fails to fascinate all of us in terms of the peopling of the Americas. Dr. Kilby is a professor in the Department of Anthropology at Texas State University and the director of the Ancient Southwest Texas Project. His research focuses on the archaeology of the earliest inhabitants of the Americas, with particular emphasis on the relationship between Ice Age foragers and the changing physical environment of the North American Southern Plains, West and Southwest. His current projects include the excavation of Bonfire Shelter, which is perhaps the earliest bison jump in North America, new research at Mockingbird Gap in New Mexico, and ongoing research into Clovis lithic technology and caches. So welcome, Dr. Kilby, and thank you so much for sharing some perspective and your research with us today.
Hi, thank you so much, and thanks for inviting me. I'm really honored to be part of this webinar series that you guys do. And way back a long time ago, when I was working on my master's degree, I got to partner with Crow Canyon on some data and some sites. I was part of the Small Sites Project, and so yeah, Crow Canyon's always been sort of near and dear to my heart. You guys, I like what you do, so I'm honored to be part of this.
Thank you so much. You got to come back. We'll
Yeah, I'd
go
love
walk
to.
around that area again at Sand Canyon.
Yeah, I miss it.
All right.
I guess I'll go ahead and share my screen. You guys seeing that okay?
You're coming through clear.
Okay, cool. So what I'm going to be presenting on today is mostly derived from a chapter in a forthcoming book called The Paleoindian Southwest. This is an edited volume compiled by me and Bruce Huckle, and I suspect many of you knew Bruce or at least familiar with his work, and you know that he passed away this spring. And as you might expect, his influence pervades this presentation and the entire book. The chapter itself is an overview of the development of Paleoindian research in the Southwest and a sort of an overview of how much critical sites and critical research in the Southwest has influenced our understanding of Paleoindians on a continental scale throughout the Americas. The chapter in the book is entitled "The Hunters Were Here First," and here's why. In 1953, Emil Hari puzzled in print over the relationship between the newly excavated Naco site in the San Pedro Valley of southeastern Arizona and Cochise sites from nearby Whitewater Draw. And the Cochise sequence was sort of the best understanding at that point of the archaic time period in the Southwest. And the very first proposed period of the Cochise sequence was called the Sulphur Springs stage. And in Sulphur Springs, you had mammoth remains associated with groundstone and some coarse tools. And this is very different than what they'd seen already at like Blackwater Draw, where you had very finely made stone tools associated with mammoth. You know, it looked very much like a hunting adaptation. They referred to that as the Llano culture. And so at Naco, way down here in southeastern Arizona, what they found is a disarticulated single mammoth with 8 what we now call Clovis points embedded in the animal. He referred to them as Llano points. And this produced sort of a conundrum in light of the Sulphur Springs discoveries, and he entertained 3 possibilities. Emil Hari did. One of these is that the Llano or Clovis hunters were on the landscape first, and these later folks with groundstone technologies and so on intruded on them during the same time period when there were mammoth on the landscape. The second is that the plant processors were here first, and they were intruded upon by Clovis hunters from the plains. A third thing that was entertained by folks at the time was that maybe these are 2 seasonal components of the same thing, of the same people on the landscape. And maybe hunting mammoth is what you do part of the year, and grinding up edible plants is what you do in another part of the year. And so after detailed work here at Naco and in Whitewater Draw and at the site of Ventana Cave, Emil Hari came to the conclusion that the hunters were here first. That Clovis predates stuff in Whitewater Draw and other archaic sequences around the region. And that sort of established Clovis and the Paleo-Indian period as the beginning point for culture histories in the southwestern United States. And that was to be sort of verified by radiocarbon dates a few years later from the nearby site of Laner, also there in southeastern Arizona. Ever since then, the Southwest has played an outside role in our understanding of the earliest peoples in what we now call the Americas. A lot of the original discoveries were made either in the Southwest or near adjacent to the Southwest on the edge of the plains. We'll talk about those in a couple of minutes. And a lot of the early ideas about who Paleo-Indians were and how they made a living and what kind of world they occupied, a lot of those ideas were sort of derived from Southwestern studies. And so we often think of the Southwest as being this sort of laboratory for early archaeological and anthropological methods and techniques. And the Paleo-Indian period is no exception. It really is where a lot of our earliest ideas about Paleo-Indian archaeology got sort of hammered out. So before we continue much further, so we're all on the same page, let me clarify what I mean by Paleo-Indians. Paleo-Indian is a term made up by archaeologists. obviously, to represent a time period. And so it's based on the things that archaeologists have available to them to study, material things, artifacts, in this case, mostly stone tools, animal bones, features in the earth, and so on. So it doesn't necessarily represent a particular culture. They didn't necessarily speak the same languages or share the same ideologies. But these are groups that we call techno-complexes in the sense that they shared similar technologies that allows us to view them as sort of similar adaptations archaeologically. So first and foremost, Paleoindian period is a time period. And these dates are always in flux and they're always open to being changed, but we know that it goes back at least 13,400 years ago or so. And you'll notice I have a question mark after that. There are some indications, I'll get to those a little later on, that it could be 10,000 years more than that. But consistently, we have a strong signal in the archaeological record that begins with Clovis. And the earliest Clovis in the Southwest and in North America goes back about 13,400 years ago. And it sort of peters out, it transitions into the early Archaic about 9,500 years ago. These dates and all the dates that I'll talk about, or most of the dates anyway, that I'll talk about are calibrated radiocarbon dates. And so as you guys probably know, when you get a radiocarbon date, it's an estimate based on a decay rate in carbon-14. And that is biased by the amount of solar radiation in the atmosphere over the years. And so you have to calibrate that against ideally tree rings, but also sea corals and other records to get an actual, number of 365-year days. And so when I say 13,400, that's our best estimate of actual calendar years. Radiocarbon and raw radiocarbon dates, that looks almost 2,000 years earlier. Those dates tend to be in the 11,000s. So that's the time period we're talking about. What these folks are doing, as best we know, is these are hunter-gatherers engaged with a late Pleistocene landscape, living in a late Pleistocene environment, engaging with the ecology of the late Ice Age. They are fully modern humans, though. We're talking about physically and behaviorally modern people like you or I or modern Native Americans. And I say that because in the early days of anthropology, there were some expectations that the earliest record of the Americas might be akin to, say, Neanderthals or other archaic Homo sapiens that are seen in other parts of the world. Everywhere in the world by this time period, we're talking about fully modern humans. And these are the early ancestors of the modern indigenous people of the Americas. This time period, though, globally, worldwide, is what we refer to as the Upper Paleolithic. And particularly the earliest parts of the Paleoindian period have some key characteristics that make them fit right in with the early Paleolithic. What that means technologically for people around the world is this is before bow and arrow technology. You'll notice in this picture here, this is one of my favorite artist depictions of what a group of nomadic Pleistocene hunter-gatherers may have looked like. They're not carrying bows and arrows, they're carrying spears. They may very well have used atlatls, spear throwers. This is before farming or ceramic technology. Ceramics are really not that convenient for people who are this mobile. And so certainly the properties of clay for various things would have been known to these folks. It's just that fragile ceramic pots are usually pretty tough to maintain as you're moving around the landscape frequently. What we do know them by archaeologically are some pretty sophisticated and distinctive stone tool technologies. And with the caveat that I sort of laid out before, that we as archaeologists know these folks mostly through their technology, mostly through these bits and pieces that survive decomposition over tens of thousands of years. We recognize them and classify them according to stone tool technologies. You get back 10,000 years ago or so, and we're talking about a different environment than we're familiar with today in the Southwest and across the Americas in general. And one of our best indicators of these environments are oxygen isotope ratios and ice cores. And so what you're looking at here is the Greenland uh, ice core sequence. And generally from bottom to top, it says right here, we're looking at colder temperatures here and warmer temperatures here. And we've got a timeline along the bottom of thousands of years ago before present BP. And if you compare it to my little outline I've made over here, we're looking at this time period between 15,000 and 8,000 years ago. And so environmentally, what you see around 15,000 years ago is this is full-blown late ice age conditions. Pretty cold, wet. Certainly not everything's under glaciers, certainly not in the Southwest, but cooler and wetter and less seasonal as well. Less seasonal variation. So summers are quite a bit cooler. Winters may actually have been a little bit warmer, but the average temperature is quite a bit colder. You see a very abrupt rise in temperatures at the end of the Ice Age and a gradual cooling again during this period we call the Booling Alarud. And that's when Clovis folks are on the landscape. Gradual cooling until, again, a pretty abrupt return to almost full glacial conditions between about 12,800 and 11,600 years ago, this period we call the Younger Dryas. And that just as abruptly ends about mid 11,000s, and things start rebounding and warming toward what we consider to be normal for the Southwest, for the Holocene. Warmer, drier temperatures, more seasonal variation, and so on. So what that means for what we know to be the first inhabitants in the Southwest is that the environment they encountered was quite a bit different than we're familiar with. Cooler and wetter, as I said. Not everything covered in ice. It's not like Disney's Ice Age movie. It would have been, I think in my mind, it may or may not be accurate, but often I sort of envision large parts of the Southwest being like eastern Wyoming or Montana today. So lots of grasslands, spruce and pine forests at lower elevations in the Southwest than they are today, and much more abundant water on the surface. Springs and streams are running what are now dry arroyos and dry draws across the Southwest. We're probably running year round. Not only that, but a lot of the dry basins around the Southwest would have held playa lakes, and some of them quite extensive. So lots of available surface water, and on that landscape, herds of grazing animals. You can sort of think of it like a cool weather African savanna, where you have mobile herds of grazing animals along with predators that are pursuing them. During the Clovis time period, that would have included mammoth. On other parts of the landscape, Gomphotherium, a relative of the mastodon, perhaps mastodons in more forested locations. Mammoth tend to be grazers and plains oriented. Mastodons tend to be browsers and presumably more woodland oriented. Bison are the ancestors of modern bison. These are bison antiquus, so they're about a third larger than a modern bison. Probably also moved in smaller herds. We think of bison as moving in herds of hundreds or thousands of animals, and it looks like these late Pleistocene bison herds maybe behaved more like elk herds. So you had 25 or 50 animals in a herd. In addition to that, ground sloth, Pleistocene horses, camels. There are some indications that people, as you see depicted in this picture, have already formed this alliance with dogs that we enjoy today. We don't have any dog skeletal remains associated with the early Clovis, with the early Paleoindian periods that I'm aware of. But the genetics of Native American dogs indicate that they not only go back as early as people do in the New World, but they sort of branch off from Northeast Asian populations about the same time as the human genetics do. So that suggests that they were already paired up when they came into what we now call the Americas. So we divide the archaeological record up into some time periods that I refer to here as techno-complexes. And, often we call these archaeological cultures, but really that's giving ourselves too much credit. We know very little about, as I said, languages that were spoken, ideology and religious beliefs, those sorts of things. Mostly what we have to go on is technology. And even in that sense, we're mostly looking at stone tool technology because that's what preserves over this long time period. Certainly, these folks are sophisticated woodworkers, presumably weavers, hide workers, lots of things out of soft technology that are just invisible to us today as archaeologists, except in very rare circumstances. So based on this technology, we divide the early prehistory, the Paleoindian period, into some techno-complexes of known duration. The earliest of these that we're certain of is Clovis. Clovis, like I said, is a strong signature archaeologically across the landscape. It dates everywhere that we've dated it between 13,400 and about 12,700 years old. And Clovis is truly Upper Paleolithic technologically. Heavy reliance on bifaces, um, and in this case, fluted bifaces. Fluted points are those spear points that have a big flake driven out of the bottom, which thins the base significantly. Presumably, that's part of how you haft it onto the foreshaft or the spear that it's coupled with. The other Upper Paleolithic thing about Clovis is Upper Paleolithic style blades. And by that, we don't just mean cutting tools like knives. We mean a specific kind of elongated flake that's removed from a carefully prepared core. And these are removed serially to produce a series of long, sharp flakes of very similar size and curvature in a systematic fashion. That's one of the keys. That's one of the calling cards for the Upper Paleolithic worldwide. And it sort of disappears after Clovis. When Clovis technology transitions into Folsom technology, true blades are part of what falls out of the technological repertoire. That transition to Folsom happens around 12,800 years ago. And I, along with some other folks, did a sort of Bayesian analysis of radiocarbon dates across that transition, looking at the latest Clovis dates that we believe are solid and the earliest Folsom dates that we believe are solid, and came to the conclusion that there's potentially as much as a 200-year overlap between Clovis and Folsom, and that overlap may primarily occur on the northern plains as Folsom gradually spreads southward and basically replaces Clovis as a technology. But that was a pretty exciting development for us. This realization that at some point you probably have people making Folsom points and people making Clovis points both on the landscape for as much as 8 generations. That just as an aside, that also sort of puts to rest this notion that something caused a catastrophic demise of people at the end of the Clovis period, something like a comet strike or something like that. What we see archaeologically is thriving populations that, if anything, are actually increasing in number from Clovis to Folsom. Folsom points are like Clovis points. They're a little more finely made. They're a little more gracile, smaller, thinner, with an elongated flute that goes almost to the very tip. And like I said, blade technology drops out, still heavily reliant on bifaces as sources of mobile tools as they move around the landscape. The thing about Folsom and Agate Basin and early Plainview is that occurs right in this Younger Dryas period. And as I pointed out to you guys a minute ago, that's this sort of period of environmental whiplash that occurs at the last gasp of the Ice Age. Something happens there at the beginning of the Younger Dryas that leads to the extinction of much of the megafauna. So here between Clovis and Folsom, we see the demise of mammoth and mastodon and other proboscideans. Horses and camels disappear from the faunal record. What we're left with, the last megafauna standing, excuse me, are these giant bison. And increasingly from Folsom onward, it looks like Paleoindians in the Southwest are really focused on bison hunting and probably can be considered bison hunting specialists throughout much of this time period. Let me ask you just to make sure I keep pointing with my pointer. Can y'all see that when I move my pointer around?
Yeah, we
I'm
can
Yes.
hoping
see
so.
it. It's a little
Okay,
bit
good.
small, but we can certainly see what you're pointing at.
Okay, good. Um, after the Folsom period, there's a transition. There's this agate basin, which is pretty rare in the Southwest. It's a stemmed point. It's more common on the northern plains, but it does show up at Blackwater Draw. It does show up in some surface contexts around the Southwest. But the next sort of abundant technocomplex that we encounter is Plainview. And one of the first things you'll notice about Plainview is it lacks this fluting that we see in Clovis and Folsom points. You still get this basal thinning, and as best we understand it, it probably is technologically derived from Clovis and Folsom, but fluting drops out. These guys, everywhere that we see them, are associated with bison. And one of the things we see is an increasing size in bison kills, which probably corresponds to bison evolution, from this bison ancestor moving in small groups to a more Holocene bison herd structure where you have hundreds or perhaps even thousands of bison concentrated in these herds. That sort of plains-oriented adaptation to bison continues in the Cody complex, where you see these elongated spear types that are stemmed, and that's a significant change. This may represent different folks, or at least a different technological technique coming in from the plains, where you're using a socketed spear shaft instead of a split spear shaft. We obsess over these things as archaeologists because that's what we have to go on. Both Cody and Plainview have been tough to date, and Plainview especially goes from something like 12,100 to 11,300 years ago, and Cody from about 11,500 to 9,800. And you'll notice one thing that I've done here is left these boundaries pretty blurry. That's not just because I'm a poor graphics maker, although that might be true also, but it's because these boundaries on either end are a little bit mushy, right? That's what we know them to be now based on a limited radiocarbon sample for these sites. Allen is another point type that's presumably derived from Plains technologies that gradually transitions into the archaic sometime here around 9,000 years ago. And that's an interesting period as well because our early archaic points look very different technologically. We see heavily stemmed points, use of much coarser materials like basalt and quartzite. There has been a lot of talk and a lot of thought on whether these archaic folks are derived from the Paleoindian populations in the Southwest, or on the other hand, if perhaps Paleoindian bison hunters withdraw onto the plains as things in the Southwest become more desertified and bison herds withdraw onto the plains and are then replaced by groups out of the Great Basin that carry this stemmed point technology and are probably more generalized foragers, plant processors, broader diet breadth, not so focused on hunting. That's one of those great and interesting questions that I don't think we've fully answered yet. It's one of the things to me that makes research in this time period so interesting, even though in some cases you have so little to go on archaeologically. The questions are big and wide ranging, and any new site and any new discovery is potentially significant because it's going to help us fill in one of those little puzzle pieces. So Here we are about 70 years after the discovery of Naco in southeastern Arizona, and almost 100 years after the groundbreaking discovery at the Folsom site, which I think most people are probably familiar with. The Folsom site is the one that indicated once and for all that the ancestors of Native Americans have been in the American continents for since the last ice age. So what I've done to try to make sense of these, 9 or 10 decades of archaeology done since then, is to choose what I consider to be key archaeological sites in the history of Paleo-Indian studies in the greater Southwest. And I use that term greater Southwest for a reason. Often when we think about the Southwest, we forget that half of that culture area, half of that geographic area lies in Mexico. And when we're talking about New Mexico and Colorado and Arizona, we're really talking about the northern Southwest. The southern Southwest, from the perspective of Mexico, is of course the Northwest, but this name Southwest has sort of stuck. Defining what that may be in the Paleo-Indian period is a little bit trickier because a lot of what we defined the Southwest based upon as a culture area may not have existed at that time. Some of it definitely didn't. Agriculture, ceramics, Puebloan architecture, etc. And even some of the environmental distinction is a little blurrier. It looks like much of the Southwest was very much like a plains environment today with grasslands and abundant water and colder, wetter environments at higher elevations. But I still like this classic definition of the Southwest. For one thing, it's easy to remember, which is that the Southwest extends from Durango near you guys, or many of you guys, from Durango to Durango in Mexico, and from Las Vegas, Nevada to Las Vegas, New Mexico. So this big, this area in the Southern Rocky Mountains down through the basin and range well into northern Mexico. Some of these sites that I've included, you'll notice, are on the periphery of the Southwest, including especially Folsom and Blackwater Draw, Bonfire Shelter, which I'll talk a little bit about. These are at the margin between the plains and the Southwest, but they play such an important role in Southwest Paleo-Indian studies that they warrant inclusion, I think. And then some of you might also notice that there's some sites on here, excuse me, that aren't actually Paleo-Indian sites. Sites like Ventana Cave, sites like Sandia Cave, but they also play an important role in us sort of, I use us collectively, of archaeologists figuring out the Paleo-Indian period. So these are our key sites, and some of these are clusters of sites that I'll be talking about in the next few minutes. The next thing I did was I put together a timeline of discovery and major fieldwork episodes and key publications associated with these sites in order to sort of make sense of this historical development of research. Probably a historian would cringe at this a little bit, but I think like an archaeologist. So I come up with a series of phases, right? And so if you look at this, the green, if you can't see it clearly, represents when a site is initially discovered. You see the earliest ones here are Folsom, double adobe, which turns out, like I said, not to be Paleo-Indian. That's that Sulphur Springs Cochise site. The yellow represents major fieldwork episodes. And one of the things to notice is that at some of these really important sites, there's not just one episode of fieldwork. It's ongoing all the way up into the present. And key publications. And this, like some of the other things, like the selection of the sites themselves, is subjective. These are publications that have influenced other research throughout the Southwest. These are the publications that you see cited over and over. These are the publications that sort of made maybe the biggest splash at the time. There's lots and lots of other publications on these sites that in an ideal world would be included as well. So what I did is divided this up, hold on, into some different phases. And so the early part of the history is the early, late 1920s, mid 1920s, up until the early 1940s, when a lot of the initial discoveries were made around the Southwest. In the 1950s through the mid 1970s, we have this establishment of the Southwest record. Based on those discoveries and a bunch of new discoveries, we start sort of figuring out what that record looks like, being able to divide it up into those different techno-complexes that I described just a few minutes ago. Since the 1980s, I have sort of subdivided this into two eras, and one of these is a return to a lot of those classic sites discovered in the first 50 years or so of archaeology. There's a methodological revolution that happens in archaeology in the 1960s through about the 1980s, the new archaeology. That coupled with radiocarbon dating and some other technical advances allowed us to start going back and revisiting some of those other sites and being able to ask more nuanced questions and gain new information that wasn't able to be extracted the first time around. And then this last 20 years or so, 25, I should say, is what I argue to be an era of new discoveries. Several new important sites have come to light in the last 20 years, and it's a pretty exciting time to be involved in Paleoindian stuff in the Southwest. So what I am going to do for the remainder of the presentation is just sort of go through these time periods and talk about, the greatest hits of Southwestern Paleoindian research and some of the influence that that's had on our understanding of Paleoindians in general. This era of initial discoveries, 1927 to 1943. You'll notice I say initial discoveries and some dead ends. We're still sort of figuring out what this record means at this point. The first of these, of course, like I said, is a story that most people are pretty familiar with, and that's the discovery at Folsom, New Mexico. Way up in the northeastern corner of New Mexico, on the edge of the plains, not too far from the lower front range of the Rockies. After a catastrophic storm and flood in 1908, George McJunkin discovers the remains of ancient bison eroding out of an arroyo when he's out cleaning up, mending fences and rounding up lost cattle after this flood. He recognizes this as these bones as not being modern bison and being of paleontological interest. He, along with some folks in Raton, let the Colorado Museum know, and they don't really follow up for another almost 20 years. But 1926 is when Barnum Brown makes this discovery here at the Folsom site that among these bison bones is found a pretty sophisticated looking spear point. And that in itself is of interest because a lot of the sort of search for what they were calling early man sites was based on the notion that early technologies should be crude, would be expected to be crude. And on the contrary, what they found is pretty sophisticated technology, these fluted, thin, very well-made points associated with extinct Ice Age bison. Now, this didn't immediately take hold. There was lots of skepticism. And one of the things that finally sort of confirmed it was a series of Southwestern archaeologists who were gathered that year in 1927 at the Pecos Conference and over at Pecos Pueblo with A.V. Kidder. They made the trek overland to visit the site. This was actually the second year of excavation there. They were sort of trying to prove their finds that they had initially made the year before. And to a person, that crew of elite archaeologists who inspected the site agreed that this is what it appears to be. This is smoking gun evidence of late Ice Age people in the New World hunting an extinct form of bison. And so an exciting time. One of those people is Frank H. Roberts, who was part of the Pecos Conference. He had done work in Puebloan archaeology in northern New Mexico. He became so enamored and so interested with Paleoindian archaeology that he went on to work at the Lindenmeyer site, and it's there that he first coined the term Paleoindian to refer to these ancient ancestors of modern Native Americans. So that's where that term comes from. This discovery led to lots of activity searching for other, quote, early man sites. It would be several more decades before they started talking about early women. So at this time, they're searching for early man and still caught up in this sort of European idea that they ought to be found in caves. And based on Folsom, they think the West is where these caves are going to be found. Howard and Cotter start working in the Guadalupe Mountains down here in southern New Mexico, and work there ultimately. Well, while they're working in the Guadalupe Mountains, they get a telegram, try to make this long story short, from a rancher up in the vicinity of Portales and Clovis, who sees a newspaper article about their research project and says, you know, I know of a place in Anderson Basin where you have Ice Age megafauna and stone tools on the surface. And so they gave it a visit, but it wasn't until road crews started mining that location in the Anderson Basin that they actually encountered, and when they're digging out gravel, they encountered lots of mammoth remains and stone tools and so on. This is when it pays to be a crusty grad student, because Howard was engaged in classes and stuff in Pennsylvania and sent his grad student Cotter to go monitor things at this gravel quarry. And Cotter is the one to first discover what would now be known as the Clovis site in 1932. Clovis actually has, it confirms two things. One is there's a Folsom occupation at Clovis. And so that's as close as we can get in archaeology to having a second example of something to be able to do replication like you would in a lab experiment if you were a chemist. And so Clovis gave us a second Folsom occupation, same technology, same kind of fossil animals, same apparent time period, which confirmed if there are any doubts about Folsom, here's another example. And but wait, there's more. Underneath that Folsom level is this Clovis level with these thicker, more robust spear points, and associated with even earlier animals, mammoth, as well as bison. So that sort of establishes, nationally and internationally, the presence of people here during the last ice age. It's around not too much after this, you get some other claims for early sites that end up not really panning out. Frank Hibben at Sandia Cave argues that there is a Folsom component there and a layer of travertine, which is a hard, crusty layer. And underneath that, you have these shouldered points that are associated with much earlier Pleistocene animals, including rhinoceros and so on. There's some things about the site that just don't fit in with other patterns that we're seeing around the Southwest. This eventually gets sort of dismissed as being either, poorly interpreted at best and perhaps a hoax at worst. Sandia Cave made a big splash at the time. As a matter of fact, Hibben was one of the first ones to talk about a Solutrean connection based on these shouldered points. But by about the 1960s, it was pretty well dismissed as not being a valid site. And this Sandia man is no longer part of our series of techno complexes in the Southwest. Similarly, at Ventana Cave, we have some Pleistocene animals and associated with at least one point, which was thought to look Folsom-y. Reevaluation of that site as well indicates that it's probably early Archaic, and you have mixed deposits in there that include some earlier paleontology. So around the Southwest, this period is really Folsom and Blackwater Draw make a big splash and establish the record. And I guess what both Ventana Cave and Sandia have in common is they used those discoveries at Folsom as an index fossil to argue that here's something, we have Folsom, and here's something older underneath it, just like was found at Blackwater Draw. Those two sites, though, don't end up continuing to play a role in Southwestern studies. By the 1950s, things are getting exciting. And a series of new discoveries in the early 1950s here in the San Pedro River Valley of southeastern Arizona becomes what remains to be the densest concentration of Clovis kills known anywhere in North America. We already talked about Naco. Naco led to a closer inspection of a lot of this river valley, and they recognize that there is a particularly distinctive stratum called a black mat, which is a younger Dryas geological feature, and that this was a good indicator of the location of sites. After Naco, the Laner site is found in the modern Arroyo Channel adjacent to the San Pedro River Valley, just under that black mat, as you'll see in the stratigraphy here. Now, Laner is, it stood out because you have 9 mammoths that are all associated with Clovis points. And now, as a matter of fact, it looks like there's as many as 13 mammoth that are there. Direct association with Clovis points, again, lots of butchering tools, which you don't see at Naco. And this led to, again, closer inspection of the greater river area and led to the discovery of the Murray Spring site, which Vance Haynes and Bruce Huckle both like to point out is the only Clovis site they know of that was discovered on purpose. And so they're tracing the black mat around the San Pedro River Valley, and they find what becomes the Murray Spring site, which has actually 3 components. First is a mammoth kill. Excellent preservation. There's a riverbank there that was quickly buried by that younger Dryas black mat, where you can actually see mammoth and bison and perhaps horse footprints in the riverbank. Also some bone preservation, including this ivory tool, which we call a shaft wrench, although there's unsure of the actual function of that tool. It's one of the rare times when you have the degree of preservation to see a little bit of soft technology. Across the arroyo is another Clovis kill, in this case a bison kill. 9 bison antiquus associated with several projectile points, Clovis points, as well as some of these upper Paleolithic style blades, again with butchering tools. As if that weren't enough, up on the terrace above the arroyo where both of these kills are is a Clovis camp with thousands of artifacts. This is shallowly buried, mostly surficial, and it's hard to tell exactly, which of these components it might fit with, except for the fact that this little piece of projectile point here actually came from the Clovis camp. You actually have this broken tip of a projectile point up here in camp that refits to a spear point that was down here in the bison kill. And so that refit indicates that people were occupying this camp as they butchered and consumed the bison from this kill. Presumably, as you're filleting bison meat down here and taking it up to camp for further filleting and perhaps smoking or drying or preserving the meat, this little bit is stuck in the meat and gets carried back to camp. So at this time, you should be detecting a pattern, which is that Clovis and Folsom tend to be associated with big Ice Age animals. And this becomes the understanding of what Paleoindians are subsistence-wise. They're specialized big game hunters. And that becomes our understanding of the Paleoindian period continent-wide. So much so that Paul S. Martin in the 1960s ties this all together into an argument that not only were Clovis people really good mammoth hunters, but they're responsible for the extinction of mammoth and other paleofauna. He called this the overkill hypothesis, and it's an idea that's still sort of bandied about today, although we think of it also, if anything, probably along with significant environmental change that led to these extinctions. This idea of overkill tied in nicely with the idea of Clovis being first, which after, the failure of Sandia and some other sites like Calico Hills, it was looking more and more like Clovis as the earliest thing on the landscape. And so these sort of became components of that Clovis first model. Not only are they first, but they encounter animals that have never been hunted. They're very vulnerable to overhunting, and Clovis people make their way quickly across the landscape, wiping out these megafauna along the way. It's a cool story, but it less and less seems to hold up as we get more and more data. Other significant things going on mid-century outside of the San Pedro Valley are in the middle Rio Grande Valley of New Mexico. And these sites are different than those in the San Pedro Valley. They aren't these nice, deeply buried kill sites. These are superficial, shallow buried, and extensive. But the silver lining there is this archaeological record is accessible and visible. And so while questions about hunting and subsistence are being investigated down here in the San Pedro Valley, folks up here in the middle Rio Grande are starting to look at settlement patterns and social organization. One of the first of these is Mockingbird Gap, which is a Clovis site just east of Socorro, New Mexico, which is perhaps the largest concentration of Clovis artifacts anywhere known. Over 200 Clovis points come from this site alone, which is almost as many as the rest of the Southwest combined. It extends over almost a kilometer along what's now a dry wash in the Jornada del Muerto. It presumably represents either, a aggregation of lots and lots of Clovis people coming together at this hot spot on the landscape, or reuse of that one spot over and over and over for generations as a campsite by Clovis folks. Or, and perhaps more simply, a combination of both. You have aggregations of Clovis people coming together and camping at this spot for generations. Farther north, you have Jim Judge, famous for his Chacoan archaeology, and others along with Hibben and Dawson explore the Rio Rancho site, which is also a mostly superficial site, in this case Folsom, and it has four components, technically three, which they believe also represented these sort of aggregation camps of Folsom people. So it looks like you have at least three different episodes of camping there, presumably after a successful bison hunt. You have lots of the same kind of tools that you see at other Folsom sites, but not any faunal remains. We don't have that kind of preservation there. Also, for Judge, for his dissertation in the 1970s, does this extensive survey of the West Mesa of Albuquerque all the way down almost to Socorro, identifying 33 Paleoindian sites, Clovis, Folsom, Plainview, late Paleoindian Cody sites. And his dissertation is a landmark study in the sort of site location preferences during these different time periods, associating Clovis with springs and running streams, and Folsom sites tend to prefer these playas, these freshwater lakes. Late Paleoindian folks are keying in on stream sides in broken country. It's the first time where they actually start talking about settlement patterns of the Paleoindian period. This also is sort of, we can begin to look at territories and social interaction through raw materials, looking at what kinds of stone people are using to make stone tools and where that is coming from. One of the early ideas about Folsom and Clovis hunters in the Southwest is these may be people, these may be plains groups that make their way seasonally into the Southwest, but are otherwise based in the plains. The fact that they're cycling through these Southwestern raw material types instead of bringing in plains types suggests that these are resident populations of Paleo-Indians that live in the Southwest year-round. Beginning in the 1980s, we see an emphasis on returning to some of these classic sites. Like I said, armed with some new methods and some new ideas. Lots of new work at Blackwater Draw. The Llano Archaeological Society excavated 5 new mammoth at Blackwater Draw in the North Pit. You see the discovery of the Clovis Age well by Stanford and Haynes and Peggy Jodrey, and the outlet area at Blackwater Draw. Return to Bonfire Shelter. I sort of mentioned Bonfire Shelter. It is a Folsom bison kill, Folsom in Plainview, that looks like a landform assisted kill where you run a herd of bison over a cliff, and in this case into a shelter. There's work there by Bement in the 1980s. David Meltzer of SMU returns to the Folsom site in the late 1990s and goes a long way towards doing a lot of paleo-environmental reconstruction, establishing some sort of ecological dynamics about the bison herd itself, better dating and so on. Updates that site, an excellent book on this site that came out in the early 2000s based on that work. Bruce Huckle at UNM, we started reinvestigating Rio Rancho around that same time, late 1990s. What else? And new work at Mockingbird Gap, also by Bruce Huckle and Vance Holliday. And that work continues today, which I'll talk about. In addition to these sites, also I should mention Jodrey and Stanford are working in southern Colorado at high elevation. And Linger site was known since the 1940s, but Stewart's Cattle Guard and Zapata are new discoveries of Folsom sites that are up around 10,000 feet in the headwaters of the Rio Grande, indicating that Paleo-Indians, despite cooler temperatures, are no strangers to high elevations. New discoveries that start popping up during this time period. Our work with Bruce Huckle out on the West Mesa led to the discovery of Bocanegra Wash, another Folsom camp that looks like it was on the heels of a successful bison hunt. In this case, through fine screening, we're actually able to identify tooth enamel that is consistent with bison. So we pretty sure there was a bison bone bed here in this little playa somewhere. It just isn't preserved. Water Canyon, discovered first by a CRM survey down west of Socorro, turns out to be a multi-component Paleo-Indian site. Clovis and Folsom are present, as well as a late Paleo-Indian Cody period bison kill, and also an Allen bison kill, which is now the best and only date for the Allen Technocomplex in New Mexico, which is about 9,600 years ago. And this is arguably the only deeply stratified Paleo-Indian site that we know of in the Rio Grande Valley, at least in the middle Rio Grande Valley. Other new exciting discoveries are made in the high country of southern Colorado, the Mountaineer site. First found by Steiger and also worked at by Brian Andrews and other folks at SMU. What they found here are not only high elevation Folsom occupations, but what look to be at least 4 Folsom structures. Rings of rock that probably held down hides and were appear to be wintertime structures up here at about, I think it's about 8,000 feet in western Colorado. At the other extreme of the Southwest is a discovery in Sonora. Guadalupe Sanchez, along with Vance Holliday, discover a Clovis site that is not only far south in the desert, but also associated with Gomphothere, which was thought to be extinct by the time people are on the landscape. Gomphothere is a mastodon relative. And now there are a handful of Clovis sites known to be in that region of southwestern Sonora. And those are sort of new important information is coming out of there all the time. It's also worth noting that El Fin del Mundo is one of the earliest Clovis dates that we know. That's a real solid date on that Gomphothere. That's about 13,400 years ago. So before that bombshell, this is, a broad brushstrokes whirlwind tour of, like I said, greatest hits of Southwest Paleoindian archaeology. And I argue that we're still in an era of new discoveries. And for better or worse, I suspect climate change and increased aridity is going to lead to the uncovering of some new sites. And one example of that is what's going on now at White Sands National Monument. Many of you guys, I'm sure, have heard about this. This was announced just in the last 5 years. They have discovered in the margins of this Pleistocene lake footprints of megafauna, mammoth and sloth and so on. And along with those, it turns out human footprints. There's multiple layers of human footprints there. They are, of course, you can't date a footprint. It's an impression and not an organic thing that you can date. And so what they've done is date aquatic seeds that are interspersed throughout this stratigraphy and come to the conclusion that these footprints may be as much as 21 to 23,000 years old. And that is met with the reaction that you might expect. This stands out as a huge anomaly, right? So I think we're still working through, is that dating correct? Is this what it looks like? I think we're in an era not unlike after the discovery of Folsom, where we're still trying to confirm that this pattern is real. And like Folsom, I think if it turns out that it is real, then we've got 10,000 more years of prehistory to fill in. And I think the next, generation of research is going to be oriented toward trying to fill in that gap if this site stands the test of time. Real quickly, I'll wrap up by talking about a couple of things that I'm excited about that I'm lucky enough to be involved in. We've been working at Bonfire Shelter in far west Texas for about the past 8 years. Eagle Nest Canyon is a tributary of the Rio Grande, right down here, just east of the Big Bend area. And it is what appears to be the oldest known bison drive in the Americas. You have bison presumably driven over the rim through this notch, and they accumulate down here in what's called the talus cone. And so you have these deposits with Plainview and Folsom artifacts that look like a mass bison kill that was made here. Nothing in the way of a campsite or anything, much like the original Folsom site. Just down the arroyo or down the canyon is Eagle Cave, most famous for its plant production facilities, these great big earth ovens, but it turns out underneath that you have Paleoindian remains as well. Back to Bonfire Shelter. This is what that deposit looks like. This is that talus cone, a big mound of earth under that notch, which creates a funnel. And you can actually see this white layer here is a later late archaic bison kill. All of that white is burned bison bone, and it actually extends all the way up into here. The Paleoindian bison kill is right down here. This is Marcus Hamilton, right down below his feet. You can see those pink flags. That's tracing the contour of that Folsom and Plainview age bison kill. So as it turns out, down in Eagle Cave, underneath those earth oven features, there is a Folsom age feature that is a hearth. A single adolescent bison has been roasted in that hearth and consumed. We've got cut marks on the jawbone. Radiocarbon dates put it right in the Folsom time period. You don't have any Folsom points, but apparently in the 1930s, 1939, a Folsom Point fragment was found in the shelter. This, as far as we can tell, has been lost to science. It's not at the museum where it should be. But we are currently working to see if there's some connection between this bison consumption event and the kill at Bonfire Shelter. That this may be a consumption event and camping event on the heels of that successful kill. Our other exciting project is back at Mockingbird Gap. And so as I mentioned, there are more Clovis points known from Mockingbird Gap than most of the rest of the Southwest combined, as well as hundreds of Clovis tools, thousands of pieces of Clovis debitage. And I'm working with Chris Merriman and Joe Berkman, Briggs Buchanan, Marcus Hamilton, and a group of others to revisit this site and to try and look at social organization according to raw material patterns, trying to see if we can tease apart what these aggregations may look like, what these campsites may look like. And another fascinating thing is Vance Holliday demonstrated just about 10 years ago that shallow draw next to these campsites is actually about 11 meters deep, and there's wetland deposits in the bottom of it. So this very much could be something like Blackwater Draw or San Pedro River Valley, in that you have kills nearby down in those deeper deposits. I'll point out that all these good folks are students of Bruce Huckle. So this is sort of a continuation of his legacy of work. And toward that end, I mentioned all this was part of a book that Bruce and I are working on. It's not out yet. I'm hoping it'll be out in the spring of 25. This may or may not be what the cover looks like. This is the working draft of the cover. It's being published by the University of Utah Press. And so if you find this stuff that I've been blathering on about interesting, you can find these same sites I've been talking about and this same history presented in this book. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Kilby. Really spectacular. So much information to take in. Can you stick around for to take a few questions?
Sure. Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. So maybe going back to the beginning of your presentation, because folks dutifully put questions in early on. Someone had asked about what caused the significant rise in temperature during the Ice Age. Was there a catastrophic event or something that triggered it?
And I'll try to cycle back up to that slide. There we go. To my knowledge, there's what we would call a tipping point in here somewhere. We have gradual warming and drying at the end of the end of the Pleistocene, which is probably cyclical and related to what we call Milankovitch cycles, which have to do with the interplay of the wobble of the Earth's orbit and the cyclicity of that orbit and the eccentricity of that orbit. So that's where you get these sort of cyclical ice ages and interstadials. Where it looks like there was something abrupt and weird is this sort of backlash at the Younger Dryas. And the sort of going explanation for what happens then is you get enough polar ice that melts that cold water flushes out into the North Atlantic, shuts down the Gulf Stream, and just changes both oceanic and atmospheric circulation patterns, knocks everything back into Ice Age conditions until those patterns return to normal.
Fantastic.
That's my long-winded answer to a simple question.
No, that's a great answer. Thank you. So going to your graph of the site discoveries through time, which is really interesting. One of our viewers says it appears that there's fewer paleo sites being discovered since the 80s than previous. And is that kind of an accurate representation? Or you're only kind of calling out the more important ones post 1980, which kind of ties into this whole, are we missing a whole period of occupation, based on the white sands possibilities as well?
Part of that pattern, I think, is an artifact, if you will, of the sites I've chosen. And so these, I think, are key discoveries. And so there's lots of discoveries in between these and in addition to these that didn't make my subjective list here. And so new Paleoindian sites are being discovered probably every week, especially by folks doing the legwork of CRM archaeology. And a lot of these
Right.
sites, or a few of these sites, were first discovered through the process of CRM. So that's, it's often sort of the unsung heroes of Southwestern archaeology.
Mhm.
But I would say, yeah, there are new discoveries being made. Finding Paleoindian sites is not incredibly rare. Finding well-preserved, well-buried ones is rare. And so those are
Right.
celebrated and sought after.
Absolutely. We've got sort of a more specific artifact question from one of our viewers who noticed a clear arrow point in one of your pictures labeled Sanchez et al. 2014, and they were curious
Okay,
about what material that was. It looked pretty extraordinary, and where it might have come from.
sure. And Laner's closer, so I'll point to that one too. Both at Laner and at Fin del Mundo and at Guadalupe Sanchez's site, we have Clovis points that are made out of quartz crystal. Not just quartz, but quartz crystal. And
Right.
it's particularly difficult to work. And so these guys are showing off a little bit by using this. And who knows if it had some special significance as a raw material. It appears to be used as a spear point in the same way of some of these other raw materials. But we see occasionally in Clovis use of quartz crystal, even for great big bifaces and caches. And yeah, it's hard not to think that those are probably special artifacts, special tools.
Fantastic. Well, I think we'll go ahead and stop there since we're about 11 minutes past the hour. But thank you so much. We are eagerly awaiting your book and hope that you'll come back out and visit Crow Canyon one of these days. We can go
Yeah, I'd love to.
relocate some of those small site surveys around Sand
Yeah,
Canyon.
that would be a blast. Thanks, everyone. I realized maybe I went on a little bit long, so thanks for indulging me. And thanks again for having me. I really enjoyed it and really appreciate it.
No, we appreciate it too. Have a wonderful evening. Thanks so much, Dr. Kilby.
You too. Bye-bye.